want you to put yourself in that room. Imagine that you make your living helping people orient their lives around the teachings of Jesus and God. Okay? Now imagine what it feels like when God uses your mayor to tell you that the smartest thing that you could do for your city is like the great commandment. Like, love God with everything you have. That he did not say that, but he said, if you just get your people to actually love their neighbors, our city would be changed. It was a horrible moment for us as pastors, sitting there listening to our mayor tell us, hey, you guys should do the Bible. It'd really help out our city. That moment was like my second little crisis moment. The first one was realizing unity is really important. This moment of being called to the table and invited to do the Bible by my mayor put me in crisis because I wasn't actually doing it in my own life. I was busy as a pastor and I was trying to figure out how to help people figure out life with their kids and their marriages, and we were doing outreach events and all these different things, but I was putting very little time or intentionality into relationships with my actual neighbors. And I remember driving home that day, very vividly, and just having this thought, driving out of that meeting back towards my house, and the thought that I had was this: Jesus is smart. That's it. I probably should have thought of that before, since I'd been a pastor for 10 years, right? So, is it possible that when Jesus gets asked to boil the entire text down to one thing, is it possible that he's given us a very simple strategic plan that if every believer did it, it would change the world overnight? And I went into my house and my wife Lauren and told her what had happened in this meeting, and she just looked at me and was like, so what are you going to do with that? And my wife was already down the road with some of the stuff in our neighborhood, but I really wasn't, because I was too busy. And so I didn't want to have a lot of accountability with her. And so when she asked me that question, I just said, I'm just going to hang out in the front yard more for a year. And then I'll just see what happens. And that one-year experiment has totally messed up my life. By the way, I'm in year 9 of that one-year experiment. And all I did was just try to spend more time out in my front yard and be open to what happened next. And I'll tell you a little bit about what happened in my own life here in a few minutes. Let me tell you what happened to this group of pastors that were sitting in that room. At the end, the mayor shares that. We decide, hey, let's take a couple months and pray about what we heard. We came back together 2 months later, same group of pastors, and we invited our assistant city manager into this meeting because she is the one who really valued the neighboring thing the most at our city. And so she comes into this meeting, and she's with us and this group of pastors, and she just starts talking about all these really practical reasons why neighboring matters. She talks to us about the fact that the crime rates drop drastically when people know the first names of their neighbors. That when there's a natural disaster, when there's a crisis, your neighbors are almost always your first responders because the systems get overwhelmed. She quoted Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers book to us and talked about how people live significantly longer when they know their actual neighbors. And this whole time, we're sitting there in the back of our minds thinking, yeah, this is all really good, that's powerful, and Jesus said we should do this. And then we get to the end of the meeting, we're doing this little Q&A. She looked at one of the pastors, and she wasn't trying to be mean at all. And I can't remember what the pastor asked her, but she responded, she said, hey, listen, just so you know, from where we sit at the city level, we don't see a noticeable, drastic difference in the way Christians and non-Christians treat their literal neighbors. And it felt horrible to hear somebody say that, especially as pastors, and so we started to argue with her about her perception. We're no, that can't be right. And then we just stopped and we realized she's right. In our culture, in our community, in our cities, our state, in our country, there isn't a drastic, noticeable difference in the way Christians and non-Christians treat their actual neighbors. And I think that's worth us trying to reconcile. So when God Jesus boils the whole text on one thing: love God, heart, soul, mind, strength, and love your neighbors yourself. How do we reconcile that with the fact that in this city, in our community, in our culture, where I was in Arvada, there wasn't a drastic, noticeable difference in the way Christians and non-Christians treat their neighbors? And I started to think about that and try to make sense of that. You ever see something on the news? I know this has not happened to you recently. And you start to get angry. You start to get irritated. Okay? I started to think about this question, and I started to get irritated. And then I started to ask a different question that changed my mood. I started to ask this question. I wonder how you become a pastor who's not engaged in his own neighborhood. And my mood went from like irritated and angry to reflective and convicted. And I started to read the Bible, read passages that I had taught multiple sermons on, that I had read hundreds of times, and I just started to read them in a new light. And I'm going to share one of them with you today. It's in Luke 10. If you have a Bible, you can open it up, and we'll be right there. If you don't have a Bible, we're just going to have it up here on the screen. As I've shared my story with others, I've come to realize that many of us, especially those of us who have grown up in the church, have become inoculated to the Great Commandment. It's one of these things that we hear over and over and over again, and we put on t-shirts and bumper stickers and refrigerator magnets, but then very few of us live it out, take it literally and seriously. And I think the Bible has something interesting to say about this. So we're going to pick it up in Luke 10, verse 25. I would encourage you to read this through new eyes, with a fresh look on a story that you've probably heard many times before. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" Jesus does this a couple times throughout the Gospel. Somebody comes, asks him a question. He realizes that's not what's going on here, and so he gets the person who's asking the question to answer their own question. He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." Just think about how big that is. Do this and you will live. But look at this. Here's what came flying off the page at me, once again, was in verse 29. It says this: "But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, 'And who is my neighbor?'" Jesus is sitting there, this teacher of the law, this attorney comes up and says, "Hey, summarize, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus gets the guy to give the textbook perfect answer, and this guy's first response is, "I wonder how I get out of this. I wonder if there's a loophole." It says, "But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, Jesus, neighbor, what does that really mean?" And I'm reading this, and I'm going, oh no. Here's the answer to how you become a pastor who's not engaged in his own neighborhood. All you have to do is just do exactly what this guy did. Just try to define that word neighbor so that it most easily fits into what you're already up to. Just play the definition game. Like, neighbor, come on. And what Jesus does here is brilliant. He goes into the story of the Good Samaritan. Now, it's important for us to understand, in the story of the Good Samaritan, Jesus is assuming this guy is loving the people of his same culture and custom. He's getting ready to give this guy AP graduate level neighboring. Okay, that's what the story of the Good Samaritan is. And Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan. The big idea of the story of the Good Samaritan is everybody is your neighbor. Everybody is our neighbor. Even if it's that wounded person on the side of the road, the terrorist that cares for them. Actually, everybody, that's not the big idea of the story. For most of my life, even as a pastor, I thought the big idea of the story of the Good Samaritan was everybody is my neighbor. That's not what the story says. That's not what Jesus teaches there. What he teaches there is when you care for the person in front of you, no matter who it is, you're being a neighbor. You're loving your neighbor in that moment. There's a big difference between that and everybody's my neighbor. When everybody's my neighbor, most often nobody is. Right? I mean, when we just kind of shoot at nothing, we usually hit nothing. He says, when you care for the person in front of you. So what happened to me and in my life and how I processed this whole story and the most important teaching in the Bible, when it's all condensed down to one thing, how I process that most of my life is I just kind of turned this idea of loving your neighbor, because in my mind, everybody was my neighbor. I just kind of turned it into a nice little metaphor. And what I ended up with was a really powerful metaphoric love for my metaphoric neighbor. And metaphorically, I was killing it. I was doing really well. And in real life, there are people who were sleeping 30, 40, 50 feet away from me, and I didn't even know their names. And what I've come to believe, what my friends and I who are in that room, what we've learned over the last number of years is that something really powerful happens if we as believers will draw a circle around the places that God has placed us and begin to work out from there. If we'll actually start to think that proximity matters, not just affinity. Now, I want to say this, okay, because clearly in Jesus' economy, The things that we do, some of you might be thinking, Dave, I can tell where you're going with this. I really don't have time for my neighbors because I'm already loving my neighbor with the parents on my kid's soccer team or the great stuff that I get to. I'm really passionate about the rescue mission, so I go down and I serve there, and that's loving my neighbor, or something overseas, loving my neighbor, the relationships I have at work. And I want to be really clear about something. Clearly, in Jesus' economy, all of that is loving your neighbor. I don't want to dismiss that. I don't want to devalue it at all. But here's the deal. All of that doesn't somehow sprinkle magic fairy dust over our neighborhoods, and all of a sudden Jesus wasn't talking about them. And how I worked it out in my own life is I just said, I'm just busy doing all this other church stuff and the ministry, and then I've also like to do this down there, and those are important relationships. And so I'm just going to fill my life up with all of this other stuff that under the loving my neighbor bucket, and I'll put so much stuff over there that I don't have to think about my actual neighbors. Now, when you say it out loud, it sounds crazy. But if you just allow yourself to drift into it, it's much easier. And what God did through my mayor and through the text, and it was just bringing me a point saying, Dave, something's out of alignment here. Like something's real. This thing that you've kind of drifted into, that's really weird. And what I've come to learn is that if you'll just start to confront that and admit, yeah, that is kind of strange. Like if you'll start to ask this question, like, what if Jesus meant our actual neighbors too? If you just have the courage to start having to just say, what would it look like to take the Great Commandment, this idea of loving, the second half of the Great Commandment, loving your neighbor literally and seriously. And what I've found is if we're willing to be those kinds of people, the fruit that comes out of it in our neighborhoods and in our own lives is really, really profound. And so how my friends and I started was we did something really, really simple. My buddy Jay, who wrote the book with me, he had this little exercise that we all did together. I'm going to do it here with you today. Okay, so we're going to do a test. Okay, so I want you to just kind of imagine. Let's go ahead and throw the block map up here on the screen. I want you to imagine right now that you walk outside the front door of your house, your condo, your apartment, your townhome. Okay, wherever wherever you all have neighbors. Okay, that's part of the genius of the Great Commandment. Everybody in here has neighbors. So just imagine you walk outside the front of your place, and if you want to, you can write this down on the little card or whatever there, just draw a tic-tac-toe board, but I want you to think about this, like right now, how many of your neighbors' names can you write down in the 8 closest units to you? Okay, so I know your house probably doesn't look like a tic-tac-toe board, just think about the 8 closest units. How many of your neighbors right now can you just place into each one of those boxes? Go ahead and take a second to kind of like think that through. And I'm going to ask you what your number is here in a second. So just how many of you, let's just go first names of the adults that live in those places. Okay, if you have like dogs' names and kids and stuff, then you get extra credit. Just the dog's name and not the person's name. You don't want me to go into that. I don't want to shame you right now. Okay, now some of you probably are experiencing like, uh-oh. When I did this for the first time, I could only do both names in 2 of the 8 boxes. And I realized, oh no, I've met all of these people, and most of them just weren't important enough for me to remember their name. How many of you think you could do all 8? You do the adults' names in all 8. Go ahead and raise your hand so I can see. Okay, that's about right. We got about 5-7% of the room here. How many of you, if I called you up right now, you think you could do both names in 5 or more? Raise your hand. Okay, about 30% of the room. I want to tell you something that's a staggering thought. So you're going to get one of these this is a little refrigerator magnet to help you start taking some baby steps in your own life when you leave here today. So we've handed out about 360,000 of these refrigerator magnets. So I've been in a lot of rooms like this, and I've asked this question. I've never been in a room of Christians where more than half of the room can write down more than half of their neighbors' names. That question about 5 or more, I've never been in a room where over half the room raise their hand and go, oh yeah, I can do that. Now, here's why I think that matters. In order to love somebody, it's helpful to know their first name. Right? Can we all agree on that? Like I'm not like a poet, or I don't write song lyrics about love. I'm not an expert about love, but I think I know that much about loving people, that it's helpful to know their first name. And so what happened to me in my own life, when I realized I could only do 2 of them, and I had met most of these people, is I realized I'm going to have a series of mildly awkward conversations with people. And they all went like this. They went like, hey, bro. And this is really embarrassing. I've lived next to you for a year and a half now. I've met you 3 times, and I actually forgot your name. Now, I could have gone online and figured out what his name was or snuck into his mailbox, but I'm going to tell you something. One, the second thing I said is illegal. But 2, there's something powerful about being willing to be the kind of person that can have a mildly awkward conversation with somebody else. And for me, there was something very humanizing about having some of those moments. And all this stuff was converging on me. I looked, one of my neighbors was over there across the street, and he was like one of the blank people, and I'd met him before. And I remember just walking down the driveway that first time and engaging him, and just how mildly awkward it was. And then I remember going back into my house, and we just had this on a napkin, and I just wrote down his name and his wife's name that he told me. And after about 6 weeks, I had this whole thing filled in. And God did something to me. These people went from being people that drove a certain type of car, that had a certain number of kids, that were into a certain sport, to like real people with real names and with real stories. And it went from, hey, bro, to, hey, Matt. To, hey, Matt, did you catch the end of that Broncos game? To, hey, Matt, I got this thing in my garage. I just need to move it like 10 feet. Could you help me out? To, hey, you guys are going to be watching the game, and we're going to be watching the game. Why don't we just, watch it together? To, hey, we always say we're going to have you guys over. Let's just, actually have a meal. To, sitting across a dining room table, sharing each other's stories, the things that we care about, the things that, shaped us into who we are. This thing that I, dreamed about as I was, setting up outreach events at the church, which are good, they're not a bad thing, was sitting right outside my front door. But I had to start taking some baby steps towards learning somebody's name and valuing them enough to use their name when I saw them. And some of these neighbors, they just leaned towards this. Some of these neighbors were just most of my neighbors, I thought everybody had a small group. I don't know why I thought that. Most of my neighbors, they have the same dysfunctional family of origin stuff that we all have, and they have this surfacey work stuff, and they were dying for something that went a little bit below the surface. And all I had to do was lean in. Some of my neighbors, I'll be honest, some of my neighbors don't want to be my friend. They are really busy, and they come home from work, and they grab their kids, they go off into their activities, and they pick them up, and then they're on the way back home, they grab some fast food, and then they drive back in, and their garage door goes up, and then their garage door goes down, and then they detox from their whole day, and then they wake up and they do it the next day. And I try to go, hey, what's going on? And I can just tell they're not really into it. If you have neighbors like that, don't stalk them. Okay, that's not going to go good for you. Okay, and I have a lot of grace for my neighbors that are like that, because I think that's the way that many of my neighbors experienced me for a long time. But these other neighbors, there's this person of peace principle that's also in Luke 10. I would just encourage you to look for the people around you that actually, as you lean towards them a little bit, they show some kind of an openness. The conversation just goes beyond, just waving, and that's it. Because what I found in my life, what my wife and I found in our neighborhood is so much of momentum is just getting started. And for a long time, I was just in some weird, awkward dance with a lot of the people that God had placed around me. I was just at a place where we had just kind of figured out a way, we're wave buddy. We just wave to each other, that's it. So, thank you so much. And so I think I would just encourage you to think about what would be the next small step that God's calling you to take with the people who live right around you. Or number one, do you care enough? For you, can you connect the great commandment to what's actually happening at the place where you live? And I'm going to tell you something. The Bible is soaked with this really thick theology of place. Everywhere you look throughout the Old and the New Testament, there's this principle that place really matters. That there's something sacred about the place where we live. I don't care why you live where you live, or why you think you live where you live. Maybe it's because you always wanted to have 4 bedrooms up, or it's the right school district, or maybe it's actually you don't want to live there. You just can't afford the place you want to live. Okay, I don't care why you think you're there. You're there because God has placed you there. There's something sacred that's happening right around us. And for me, that that thought started to change the way I drove in and out of my neighborhood. I started to realize there's something sacred about the place that I live. God is up to something right around me. And if you let that sink in, then all of a sudden, like, having a mildly awkward conversation becomes a lot easier because you start to realize this is something that I do out of what I believe. And I want to encourage you to just start to think about taking the next small step. What does it look like for you to take this idea of loving your neighbor literally and seriously? And I'm really excited that over the next 4 weeks you're going to be having this conversation. Because the fruit that can come from it at a church at this stage is real. I've seen it over and over and over again. If you will be willing to begin to have take the next small step, have some of those mildly awkward moments, you'll be shocked at what happens as a result. What's happening actually here at this church, this isn't normal. I wish this was normal for church plants. Okay, I think this is the 13th or 14th week that this church has met. You guys are like a real church already. Okay, so congrats on that. It's probably a better way I could have said that. So, but like, clearly God is already up to something here. But you are in a critical stage where it'd be really easy to just kind of start looking inward and figuring out the needs of just the people in this room and to have like a nice little church. You start to take this idea of like loving your neighbor literally and seriously, and you're going to have to find a different room. Because you'll start, and it's not just some bait and switch of like, I'm just doing this so I can like try to get you to say some prayers. It's because you actually share the things that you love. And they're going to share the things that they love with you too. You're going to meet people that you would never choose to hang out with. I have friends that I would never choose to hang out with. And they begin, if you get through kind of this awkward zone, friends that like, they begin to like fill in some of the voids in your life and you begin to fill in some of the voids in theirs. And I think that's part of the genius of Jesus' command to love our neighbors. And so I want to just end by praying a really simple prayer and just getting really quiet before God for a couple seconds and allowing God to speak to you. This prayer that we're getting ready to pray is really dangerous. And it's incredibly simple, and it just goes like this. It's just, God, what's the next small step that you want me to take with one of the people that lives around me? And I've just learned over and over, I pray this prayer, it's just become a rhythm in my life. And I'm just shocked at how often, if I get quiet before God, how often a thought will start come just racing into my head about a specific person who lives around me. And so if you would just bow your heads with me, we're just going to take 30 seconds to get quiet before God and pray this simple prayer and just ask him to speak to us. So God, we come here in the midst of all the hectic stuff that we're up to today, and we just are going to get really quiet before you for a few seconds. And Father, would you just give us a thought, give us a nudge, each one of us. What's the next small step that I can take with one of my neighbors? So my prayer for Journey Point would be that you become the type of people that reflect and consider the Word of God, and then you actually live it out. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to start thinking about like the most basic thing that Jesus talked about doing. And so I would guess that for a lot of you in this room, that one specific person came to mind as we prayed that prayer. And so I'd encourage you to go and to actually act on it. It's really easy to come into environments like this every Sunday and like hear something really powerful, and then to get in your car and to go, that's good, can't wait till next week. Or I have a desire to do something like that or an aspiration to do it, but then not to actually do it. But I hope what we've done here today has made it like so concrete and so simple that you actually have something that you go, all right, that's like really clear. Maybe for a lot of you, it's just to have some of those awkward conversations, learn some names. My friends and I in Arvada that did this began to see fruit all over the place. And the biggest leadership lesson I learned from this was, most of my life people told me good leaders set the bar high. What I've learned through this is like if you want to start a movement, the key isn't to set the bar high. The key is to set the bar so low that people can't crawl underneath it. And so today, you're going to walk out of here with a refrigerator magnet. And most of you in this room, from the show of hands, like your first step is to go and to like learn and retain and use the names of the people that live around you. And so I'm hoping that you'll put this on your fridge and you'll let it mess with you. You like look at some of those blank squares and there'll be some sense of conviction where you go, all right, I'm going to do something about that. And my hope is that once you do, that what happened in my life will happen in yours. And that it'll lead to the next small step and the next small step and the next small step. So I'm really pumped about your church, Chris, and about what you and Libby are doing here and your entire team that I've got to meet. And so I'm going to be praying for you guys, and I'm going to be pulling for you in a really significant way. So, yep, thank you.